All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to the SCIP webinar series, and thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, What is Value? My name is Michelle Winter and I am the Manager of Global Chapters and Volunteer Initiatives at Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, and I'll be your moderator today. Here are some simple guidelines to ensure your experience will be maximized. This is a live webinar. Your computer will show the presentation and stream the live audio, so please ensure your computer audio is on. All participants will be muted during the duration of the program. There is a question and answer function that will be active during the presentation, enabling you to type in your questions for the organizer. Questions will be asked and answered as time permits. Those not answered will be addressed at a later date. We do not foresee technical issues. However, Internet programs are sometimes subject to connection issues. Should this happen, we will contact you regarding rescheduling. Our program today will be presented by Richard Isley, founder of SMCG. And with that said, let's get started with today's program. Richard, the floor is yours.
Good, many thanks. And thanks all to you all very much for joining the webinar. I want to start by putting this session into some context. When we meet in November at the conference, one of the topics we're going to explore is going to be the relationship between the supplier and the customer. And we'll see that the nature of the relationship has a direct bearing on the results for the supplier. In other words, stronger the relationship, stronger the results, which of course I think makes perfect sense. So we're going to explore what we mean by a strong relationship, and we'll see that the level and the quality of the information and the intelligence we possess will in itself have a direct bearing on the strength of that customer relationship. A key part of the session in November is going to focus on the idea of value. And it's that issue, value, that I want to talk about today. Shall we put the slides up now? Thank you very much. Now, value, I find, is one of those things which we all talk about, but quite often it's difficult to define. And even when we do define it, we find that our view can quite often differ from the customer's view. So I thought it'd be helpful to start our discussion today by really just posing a rhetorical question to ourselves. And we're going to see that on the next slide, please. So the question that I want us to consider is this: do you provide your customer with added value? Well, I've asked this question to senior managers quite a few times now, and I found that most of us will almost instinctively respond, yes. Yes, of course we deliver added value. After all, that's why the customer buys from us, isn't it? But here's the problem. The problem is when I ask the same customers a similar question, in other words, does your current supplier provide added value to you? Well, I get a different view, and we're going to see that on the next slide, please. So these results are fairly recent. They happen to be from one industry sector, but they're fairly consistent because what we're seeing here is that in this case, fewer than a quarter of the customers that we spoke to viewed their primary suppliers as delivering added value, which means that those suppliers are really quite vulnerable. So we have a situation where the supplier thinks it's delivering high value, and yet the customer more times than not disagrees. Is that a problem? Well, yeah, it's a problem because shortly we're going to see that those suppliers which are seen as providing added value are also the suppliers that tend to enjoy much better commercial returns from their customers. So we really do need to think about what's going on here. In particular, we need to think about why we've got this discrepancy, in some cases quite a significant discrepancy, between the supplier's view and the customer's view. So to help us answer that question, I want us in this session to focus on the supplier. So what's going on then with the supplier? Well, when we really investigate the situation, we find that there are really 4 common issues, and we're going to summarize those on the next slide, please. So here you see 4 very common issues that we find, and I'll work my way through each one and just expand a little bit. The first very common issue is the supplier which is primarily focused on life from its own point of view. Now, that's quite normal, I think. Most of us have a subjective view of the world and the way the world works, and we see the same thing happening at the corporate level. In other words, the company itself has its own subjective view, and quite often it's not a view which is shared by the customer, and also you find that it's rather unlikely that someone within the company is going to challenge that view. You get a kind of corporate group think, if you will. Incidentally, I find that the best time to get a manager to challenge a company is within the first 3 months of the manager joining, because after that the novelty of the new company is going to fade and the new manager starts to absorb the common view. So this first situation is simply that the company managers tend to have a subjective view which is focused on their own internal situation. They don't see the world from the customer's point of view. Second common issue is that the supplier lacks the right intelligence, the right understanding. And in some cases quite basic understanding. For example, it may well be that it doesn't really understand its own market. Now, that might sound quite strange. After all, a company operating within its own sector surely is best placed to understand that sector. Well, not always. And as a quick example, I've just been talking with a large packaging group in Europe, which is looking to expand its business and yet doesn't really understand its own market share in each of the sectors it operates in. And similarly, you find that sometimes the supplier doesn't fully understand its own customer. Typical situation is we're only talking to the buyer, perhaps, or maybe we're just reacting to customer requests. But either way, it's very difficult to understand value from the customer's point of view at that level. Third problem is very closely aligned to the second, and that's where the supplier is not really properly assessing its direct and its indirect competitors. Now, I should just say, when I talk about indirect competitors, what I really mean is those companies which don't compete directly against your products and services. In other words, they don't have similar products and services, but they will compete for what I call the drivers of success. Let me give you an example just to make it clear. Let's assume we're selling consumer packaged goods. This is a market that I think all of us will be familiar with. And let's say we sell candy, confectionery. Now, that's very much an impulse product, and our customers will be the major retailers. So we'll want to put our product in those high impulse areas by the checkouts. But of course, there are other high impulse products out there. Batteries, for example, and batteries offer the retailer a much higher profit per square meter return than our confectionery. So we'll find that the battery manufacturers are competing for the same space that we want for our products. So that's what I mean when I talk about an indirect competitor. So if we're not aware of likely competitive activity and more importantly, the impact that competitive activity is likely to have on our customer, then we're going to have a real problem. The final point on my slide here is very closely related to the first point, and that's where the supplier may not have properly identified exactly what the customer expects when the customer talks about added value. So with that in mind, let's now think about exactly what do we mean when we talk about value. And to do that, we'll look at the next slide, please. So I'm going to suggest to you that value is simply this. It's something which makes the customer better off, or at least feel better off. So key point here is it's the customer that defines value, not the supplier. So when we see a a company or a supplier with a universal value proposition, then we have to be concerned, because it suggests that all customers are the same. Now, ideally, value is something we want to try and measure. We want to try and measure the extent to which the customer's better off. So I think ultimately we can think about value as something for which the customer pays a premium. And as a supplier, we have to justify the premium. So if the customer doesn't want to pay for the thing that we call value, well, then we have to question whether it's value at all. Many of the things which the supplier thinks of as adding value, quite honestly, are viewed by many customers as just part of the basic offer. So as a quick example, I was recently talking to a company, and one of the exercises we did was to ask them to list those things which they perceived to be adding value. And on the list, we saw a high quality product. We saw delivery on time, having responsive people, these sorts of things. And of course, when I talk to the customer, well, they disregard these things as basic. These are the things which are essential to establishing the relationship in the first place. They're not adding value. They're not bringing a competitive edge. So unless your significant competitors are unable, let's say, to deliver on time, it's very unlikely that that sort of thing is going to give you any sort of competitive differentiation or added value. So we have to think about value as something which is making the customer better off, ideally in a measurable way, and ideally something which your competitors are going to struggle to replicate. Why is that so important? Well, it's important because we find that there's a direct relationship between perceived added value, what the customers think, and your performance. In other words, those suppliers which are seen by their major competitors, their major customers as delivering added value consistently, and that's important, they also tend to enjoy better results. So if we could look at the next slide, please. What we're going to see here is that suppliers which are deemed to be consistently adding value, they tend to have a higher share with those customers. And by share, I mean share of the market which they're eligible to get, which their products and services could legitimately supply. They tend to be the significant shareholders. And they also tend to have higher margins. So they're not getting share simply because they're buying it. They've got this high share and high margins. And they have high margins primarily because they're able to identify what value really means. They're able to cut out some of those things which you do because you think are worthwhile, but frankly deliver nothing. So you simply bear cost, you deliver not very much, you can cut those things out. At the same time, of course, they're focusing on those things which really do deliver value to the customer, that the customer's prepared to pay for, which again supports the margin. Third thing that we see is that these types of suppliers are going to be regarded by their customers as strategic partners, or words to that effect. Essentially, these are the folks who we're most likely to talk to when we've got a strategic initiative, when we've got some significant question. They're the go-to people, which of course in turn means that they're more likely, these suppliers, they're more likely to participate in the customer's development initiatives, and of course that in itself drives performance. So the whole thing starts to become a virtuous circle. If I'm perceived to deliver value, I get more opportunities to deliver value, so I get more value. So if we want to enjoy higher performance with a customer, we really have to consider what value means for that customer, how we deliver it, and what that means is we have to have a really, really good understanding of the market, the competitors, and of course, that customer. And as a result of that, particularly with a focus on the customer, we'll find that we actually change the nature of the relationship. And it's that relationship that I want to talk about in more detail when we get together in November. Our final slide today really looks forward to that conference, and it considers what this might mean from a practical point of view. And to help us think about that, I've just extracted two quotes one from Unilever acting in this case as a supplier, and the other from one of the Walmart divisions, in this case acting as the customer. And so you see here the Unilever quote is really talking about understanding. It's about getting information, getting data and insight and leveraging that. And you see that the retailer's quote is really all about joining in with that relationship and recognizing that unless the customer is part of the partnership as well, where you just don't get the success that you might otherwise achieve. So those really are the main points that I want to make today. And so I'll be very happy if there are questions to try and answer those.
Thank you so much, Richard. I would like to actually start the Q&A part of our program. I will read the questions that have been submitted during the presentation, and we'll get as many in as we possibly can in our allotted time. Excuse me. Okay, Richard, the first question that I see, why don't we just ask the customer what value means for them?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's one I hear quite often. You know, why don't we just go and talk to the customer? Customer will tell us what we have to do, and we do it. And certainly, talking to the customer is a critical part of the exercise. Getting an understanding of the customer is core, and certainly, if we want to move towards more of a strategic partnership, then the customer has to be an equal player in that. So the customer's view. Yeah, it's certainly a critical component, but unfortunately it's not always as simple as simply asking the customer what he thinks, because, well, first of all, in many cases, if it's a significant customer, it'll be a complex relationship. It's unlikely to be a single person's point of view, and so we'll find that there are different managers within that customer that we have to work with, and they'll all have different views. They'll have different views of what value actually means for them. You may be familiar with the quote from Henry Ford when he was asked about this. He said, "There's no point in asking the customer, because if you ask the customer what he wants, he'll just say, 'I want a faster horse.'" Now, the point here is I think you have to interpret what the customer's saying. So certainly we should be talking to the customer, but we need to be able to interpret what the customer's saying. I also find that in some cases the customer hasn't actually thought through what value could be. And often the role of the supplier is really to think about what it could be for the customer, not simply react and respond to what the customer's doing. And in many cases, some of the feedback we get from significant customers is one of the core aspects of the added value relationship is the supplier that's able to anticipate what the customer needs to do or should be doing sometime into the future. So it's that understanding of the market trends, what the competitors are likely to be doing, but also what's really important for the customer. That helps that thinking tremendously. I hope that goes some way to answering that question.
Okay. The next question: how do you convince sales that what they think is value or competitive differentiator is not really? There's almost a sense of arrogance that they, quote, know better than the customer. We try to do everything through lost ops interviews, but blinders are often on. Can you address that?
Okay, so we've got two issues. One is sales have got a misplaced understanding of what value actually is, and I think the second part of that is we've done some customer interviews. So it cut out very slightly then. So we've done some customer interviews, and that has helped or hasn't helped.
It seems that the next sentence is that their blinders are often on. So I'm thinking that it probably means it does not help.
Okay.
She says it has, but not. It has helped, but not totally. Is what she has just put up here.
Yeah. Okay. I think it comes back to trying to take an objective view and in many ways trying to force the issue, because it's a very common view that the salespeople will kind of assume that they know what value is all about. You know, they own the customer relationship. They will tell you what the customer wants. And you have to challenge that, and you really have to oblige the salespeople to explain why they believe that's adding value, how that stacks up within the competitive position, and I think also you have to engage with the customer so you get the customer's view. The difficulty of doing that, and this is probably what's behind the question, is you have to be very careful how you ask the question. So, for example, I did some work not so long ago in the US with a distribution company. This is a company that's got depots across the country. It's about $1 billion business. One of their points of competitive differentiation that the sales department were absolutely sure about was that they could deliver within 24 hours, whereas most, if not all, of their competitors had reduced their depot network, and they were sort of 2 or 3 days away. And in order to kind of make the point, the sales department had carried out a customer audit, and one of the questions on the audit for the customer was, how important is it that we're able to deliver to you within 24 hours, scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is important? And guess what? Everyone had ticked 5. So the sales department came back and said, look, here's the definitive answer. It's really, really important. Now, if it's really important, and it's really important to the customer, what you'd expect is that the customer's prepared to pay a premium for that. So what you should find then is, if you interrogate the performance data, where that company is able to deliver more frequently, it should be doing better. It should have higher share, perhaps higher margins. There should be some objective commercial measure that demonstrates that this is actually successful for us. But none of those measures existed. In fact, there was no difference in this case between the depots that could deliver very quickly, even in some cases within 6 hours, and the depots that were quite a way away, and they might have taken 2 or 3 days. So you know, that's an issue in itself, and I find it's often quite helpful to try and force the issue, and a way of doing that is by putting a monetary value on that idea for the customer. So in this particular case, we went and talked to a few of these customers in Cincinnati. You can just take a random sample of customers, and I said, okay, look, we can deliver to you next day, and you're telling me that's very important. Or option B, we can deliver in 3 days and knock $100 off the invoice. What do you prefer? And about 90% of the respondents said, actually, we'll take the $100. So yeah, it's important as long as it's costing me nothing. But if it costs me $100, or in this case, if I save $100, and by the way, the delivery costs a lot more than that, well then I might decide that it's not quite so important anymore. So I think you have to not take these things at face value. I think you have to interrogate it, and I think when you do interrogate it, you really have to be clear about the questions you're asking and the answers you're getting, and in some cases then interrogate the answer a little bit more.
Okay. Our next question: how do you monitor the customer environment dynamics, changes in requirements and in personnel?
Okay, so is this, how do we monitor the changes in terms of people just changing, or the views of the people changing? Shall I perhaps answer both?
Yes.
I think in terms of, yeah, okay, so I think in terms of people changing, and that's very common, of course, in very large companies, you have to have some sort of customer profiling. Different companies will use different terminology, but you have to be collecting data and information on a whole bunch of aspects within the customer. One of them is who is doing what, and of course it's not just who's doing what, but what are those individuals, what's important for those particular individuals. Different people will have different levels of importance and view things in different ways. It's very good to understand what those views are. It's also good to understand what those people are measured on, because that will start to help you understand why they're doing what they're doing. So what you're looking for really is some relatively straightforward profile data management. Danger of these things is sometimes we just try and collect too much. It becomes a big administrative exercise. Some of the CRM systems we see are just not really very well used because Salesforce has given up on them because they're so complicated. They take so much time. Salespeople will argue that they get no value out of it. So I'm just trying to think what the question was. I didn't write it down, I'm afraid. Does that answer the question, you think, or is it a bit more to it?
I would imagine it does answer the question, and the person who submitted, if you have additional requests regarding this information, just send it along, and we'll make sure to get a more detailed answer. Okay, we have time for just a few more questions. The next one is, can you always measure value?
Can you always measure value? The short answer, I suppose, is no. You always try to measure value, and as I said earlier, it's really good if we can get a monetary value on it, because that really grabs the customer's attention. So much better to say we can save you $1 million than we can save you 2%, or we can make a saving. So we're trying to get a measure in terms of money, and it's either going to be, in simple terms, cost out or top line up. Now, it's not always that easy, of course, and what we have to do is think about always trying to get some form of measurement at least. I suppose really what we're going to try and do is think about what do we want at the end. What are we measuring this thing for? Quite often you'll find that we'll measure not necessarily direct results, so sales, share, margin, and so on, but we'll try and measure the things that deliver those results. So if we were in a professional service environment, which is my business, quite often you find that the way in which the client perceives the company will have a major impact on its business. Now, how on earth do you measure perception? Well, you can go and ask a question. How do you rate this on a particular scale? Or you can start to try and find some even more objective measures and create for yourself what becomes a scorecard. So it's quite interesting to start to think about what would a scorecard look like? What are the things we want to try and influence, which in turn are likely to cause that customer to give us more business, greater share, and so on. So it becomes a bit of an iterative process to think about what are the relatively few things, of all the things we could possibly influence, what are the relatively few things that we want to be able to influence, and can we get some sort of objective measure around those things. The measure you use is going to be dictated by the circumstance. It could be a whole bunch of different things. It does need to be objective, though. In other words, if I assess it and you assess it, we need to come up with the same assessment. It needs to be simple. So simple 1, 2, 3 scores, those sorts of things are very useful. Essentially, we want relatively few objective, clearly defined measures, which in turn we believe are going to drive performance. And the acid test is when we improve these scores, do we similarly see an improvement in the commercial output we're looking for? Do we see greater share, reduced costs, higher margin, these sorts of things?
Well, thank you. And that was our last question. All the questions that we did not get to during this Q&A session will be answered, and that list will be distributed to all of our webinar attendees. Today's live webinar was recorded and will be archived for future reference on the SCIP website under the Training and Events tab, where you will find the webinar archive. You will be receiving a thank you email for attending today's session, which will contain a survey link. Please answer a few short questions to share your experience and provide feedback on today's webinar so that we can better support your development and needs. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and have a good day.